Greetings to everyone across Africa and to everyone who still believes this continent deserves the right to defend its own future. There are moments in history when a nation stops reacting to war and starts redefining the rules of survival itself. And right now, that moment may be unfolding in northern Mali. After nearly 3 weeks of intense fighting, the government in Bamako is no longer speaking the language of defense. Around Kidal, Tessalit and the desert corridors near the Algerian border, continuous airstrikes have destroyed fuel depots, supply convoys, drone launch points, and strategic rebel positions. The FLA, which only days ago was talking about marching toward Bamako, is now appearing on international media asking for negotiations and political dialogue. But Mali answered with a message unlike anything the Sahel has heard in years. No negotiations, no new peace accord, no safe haven for forces challenging Malian sovereignty. And that is why this conflict is becoming something far bigger than a local insurgency. Because what we are witnessing now is not simply a military campaign. It is a direct confrontation between the AES alliance and the entire structure of foreign influence that has shaped security across the Sahel for decades. The growing accusations involving Ukraine, Algeria, cross-border mercenary networks from Sudan, and international media pressure are turning Mali into the center of a much larger geopolitical battle. In the past several days, Mali has intensified what military observers increasingly describe as a suffocation strategy. Instead of rushing into massive ground offensives, Bamako is systematically hunting the logistics that keep the rebellion alive. Fuel, mobility, communications, drone operations, supply corridors, everything is being targeted. And nowhere is this strategy more visible than around Tessalit. For years, Tessalit represented strategic depth for northern armed groups. Its proximity to the Algerian border made it one of the safest operational zones in the entire conflict. But today, even Tessalit no longer looks untouchable. Tessalit matters because in the geography of the Sahel, logistics often matter more than numbers. Whoever controls mobility controls the battlefield. And for years, northern armed groups relied on the vast desert terrain, cross-border smuggling routes, and isolated supply networks to survive even when they could not win militarily. Now that equation is changing. Recent strikes reportedly destroyed major fuel reserves and transport infrastructure linked to FLA operations near the northern corridors. In a desert war built around pickup trucks, drones, and rapid movement, losing fuel is not a small setback. It is the equivalent of losing oxygen in the middle of a fire. This is why the language coming from FLA figures has changed so dramatically in such a short time. Only weeks ago, some voices inside the movement were speaking about advancing toward Bamako and reshaping the political future of Mali by force. Today, the same movement is appearing on international Arabic media, asking for negotiations and political compromise. That shift matters. Because armed groups that believe they are winning rarely rush to discuss dialogue. They speak the language of expansion, the language of momentum, the language of inevitability. But when supply lines collapse and strategic depth disappears, the tone changes quickly. And that is exactly what Bamako appears to understand. The Malian government has now made it clear that the era of the Algiers framework is over. Officials close to the leadership continue to repeat the same message. There will be no return to old agreements that allowed armed factions to preserve parallel zones of influence in the north. For Bamako, this is no longer just about defeating a rebellion. It is about preventing the re-emergence of permanent fragmented sovereignty inside Mali itself. But the battlefield in northern Mali is no longer shaped only by local actors. What is unfolding across the Sahel increasingly carries the fingerprints of a much larger geopolitical struggle. Malian officials and pro-AES analysts continue to point toward the same external network. Algeria remains under scrutiny because of the strategic border corridors that have historically allowed armed factions to move supplies, commanders, and logistics across the desert frontier. For Bamako, pressure around Tessalit is not only military. It is also a message that no external sanctuary should remain untouchable. At the same time, allegations involving Ukrainian-linked drone support have intensified the international dimension of the conflict. Reports surrounding FPV drone training and tactical assistance have fueled claims that the Sahel is slowly becoming another arena in a broader global confrontation between rival power blocs. Then there is the Sudan connection. The growing discussion around RSF-linked fighters moving through regional smuggling corridors has raised fears that experienced mercenary networks may now be feeding instability across multiple African conflict zones at once. And behind these movements, many analysts continue to point toward financial pipelines connected to Gulf influence and transnational proxy structures. This is why the war in Mali can no longer be understood as an isolated rebellion. In geopolitical terms, the conflict is evolving into a collision between two competing visions of Africa's future. One vision still depends on foreign managed security systems, international mediation structures, and externally shaped political frameworks. The other insists that African states must control their own security decisions, even if the process is costly and controversial. And that is why this war matters far beyond Kidal. Because in geopolitics, no major crisis emerges completely by accident, especially not in a region filled with strategic minerals, fragile borders, foreign military interests, and competing global powers searching for influence across the African continent. At the center of this transformation stands one figure whose influence now reaches far beyond Mali itself. Assimi Goïta has become one of the most polarizing and symbolic leaders in the modern Sahel. For his supporters, Goïta represents something larger than military rule. He represents a generation of African leadership that no longer wants security decisions to be dictated from outside the continent. Under his leadership, Mali expelled French military influence, strengthened ties within the AES alliance, deepened security cooperation with Russia, and restructured its military posture around the idea of sovereign defense. Critics in the West argue that this approach risks militarizing politics and weakening democratic institutions. They warn that replacing one foreign dependency with another may not truly solve the deeper structural problems facing the region. But supporters of the AES answer with a different question. If the previous model worked, why did insecurity continue spreading across the Sahel even after years of international missions, foreign military bases, and billions of dollars in external assistance? That question is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. For many people across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, sovereignty is no longer an abstract political slogan. It now means control over borders, resources, military decisions, and national narratives. And this is why the AES alliance is gaining symbolic weight across parts of Africa. Not because people believe these governments are perfect, but because they represent an attempt to reclaim strategic independence in a region long shaped by outside power. In the coming months, the AES will likely intensify cross-border coordination, strengthen internal security operations, and continue building a regional military framework designed to survive without relying entirely on Western structures. Western governments and international media outlets continue to criticize the direction taken by Mali and the AES alliance. Concerns about military rule, press restrictions, and growing Russian influence are now central to the global debate surrounding the Sahel. Critics argue that heavy militarization and hardline security policies could deepen instability over time and weaken democratic institutions across the region. Those concerns should not be dismissed entirely. Questions about accountability and long-term governance remain important for any nation facing prolonged conflict. But supporters of the AES respond with a reality they believe the outside world often ignores. For nearly a decade, the old security model dominated the Sahel. Foreign troops were deployed. International missions expanded. External funding increased. Yet insecurity spread across larger territories. Armed groups multiplied, and public trust in the system collapsed. That experience changed the political psychology of the region. Today, many Africans are asking a different question. Not whether outside powers can help Africa, but whether Africa can continue depending on outside powers to define its security future. And that may be the biggest lesson emerging from Mali. Because modern warfare is no longer fought only with bullets and armored vehicles. It is fought with narratives, media pressure, sanctions, diplomacy, drones, and information control. Countries that lose control of their own story often lose strategic control of their future as well. What we are witnessing in Mali is not simply another conflict in the Sahel. It is a test of whether African states can build their own security architecture in a world shaped by competing global powers. In the coming months, all eyes will remain on Bamako, Kidal, and the broader AES alliance, not simply to see who wins the next battle, but to see whether a new geopolitical model is beginning to emerge across Africa itself. Follow the channel if you want to understand Africa from the perspective of Africans, because history does not belong to the strongest. It belongs to those who understand the rules of the game.